A fun fact, the foundation pit, the actual pit, ended up having a real-life counterpart. They never actually constructed the Palace of Soviets in the center of Moscow. 1931, they demolished Cathedral of Christ the Savior and started digging the pit, but the palace was never actually constructed, so instead they turned the foundation pit into the biggest outdoor swimming pool. That actually functioned until the 1990s, when they reconstructed the Cathedral of Christ the Savior back in its rightful place. The concept art for the Palace of Soviets looks rad, though. But we're actually here to talk about the book, The Foundation Pit by Andrei Platonov. A very interesting experience, that. Andrei Platonov, in a way, was an ideal communist writer. Platonov, bore Klimentov, Platonov is a pseudonym after his father Platon. He was born at the turn of the century, 1899, near Voronezh in a working family. His father was a worker, a train driver / machinist. His mother was a peasant / housewife. Platonov was the eldest of like 11 children in that family. So a good proletarian family, and Platonov did actually receive a pretty good education for his background. In his youth, he got dragged between the more practical applied sciences like engineering, thanks to his father, and liberal arts because he's discovered his passion for writing quite early on. However, he believed that the path to a good writer actually lay through real-life experience, primarily through manual labor. So from age like 14, he started working as an assistant train driver, for instance, while also consuming a lot of books, pretty much anything that he could get his hands on. 1918, he started at the Voronezh University, but then the Civil War broke out. He volunteered for the Red Army, first as a wartime correspondent in the front lines, then as an assistant train driver on an armored train, and he made it through the war not without honors. This is a good time to mention that Platonov was fully behind the revolution. He did believe that capitalism was an inferior system that was only gonna lead to catastrophe. However, his idea of communism and the bright communist future was rather idealistic, so the cracks started showing almost instantly. 1921 to 22, a terrible famine hit the Volga region of the newly established USSR, affecting 28 to 40 million people. We do not have good stats on the casualties, but it was severe. And for Platonov, that was a huge ideological blow. Communism was supposed to be this ideal system where people don't just simply die, especially not from hunger like that. So he took it upon himself to fix it. He led the commission for the hydrification of the Voronezh region and later electrification as well. After his relocation to Moscow, he also spent a little bit of time in the northern regions of Russia, assisting in the collectivization efforts. And again, taking a pause here, Platonov did believe that getting rid of these anti-Soviet elements, the so-called kulaks, the loosely defined groups of wealthier and exploitative peasants, was a good thing. And mind, a good outcome for a kulak was exile. And did Platonov support those methods as well? We'll see. All these activities carry Platonov through the 1920s, and that's where his writer's journey also began. 1927, his first short story is published in Молодая Гвардия magazine, and around the same time his most famous pieces are also written, The Foundation Pit and Chevengur. Neither of those two was published during Platonov's lifetime. We know that Maxim Gorky has read the Chevengur manuscript, and he found it very interesting, but doubted that it would ever be allowed into print. He was, however, very much encouraging of Platonov, just in slightly different avenues. And then something truly bad happened. Platonov's short story for future use, that was full of his disappointment in the collectivization efforts in the USSR, was published by Fadeev in Krasnaya Novь magazine. And Joseph Stalin hated it. There is a copy out there somewhere of the magazine with Stalin's notes in the margins. He called Platonov a bastard and every other name in the book. It's honestly surprising that Platonov survived this. Stalin had people shot for less. And while Platonov tried to soothe the situation over with apology letters in magazines and to Stalin directly, his career and reputation were never the same after that. He did work and write. He wrote mostly plays, screenplays, and some non-fiction. He also took a trip to Turkmenistan, and some fiction came out of that. 1938, a personal tragedy struck. Platonov's 50-year-old son, called Platon, got arrested under political reasons, a weird case against him and his friend, espionage. The friend was executed. Platonov pulled every string that he could, so Platon only spent 2 years in a hard labor camp where he contracted tuberculosis that took his life a few years later. Some speculate that this case against the son was actually the punishment for the father, but we have no concrete proof of that. During World War II, Platonov served as a war correspondent, and some war fiction did come out of this time period, and it was even published. In 1944, however, he started suffering from tuberculosis himself, likely contracted from his son, and so from that point on he was mostly bedridden, but still continued to write up until his death in 1951. The obituary published in Literaturная Gazeta was signed by every prominent author of the time period and stated, Andrei Platonov was closely connected to the Soviet people, he devoted the strength of his heart to them, he gave his talent to them. Platonov's wife and later his daughter preserved the unpublished manuscripts. Some circulated in samizdat and some even were published abroad, but the first official publication occurred in the late 1980s here in Russia. This is actually a pretty early copy, relatively speaking. This is Chevengur, published 1989. So the original plan was to read Chevengur. I was already familiar with the Foundation Pit and how heavy that story is. I must have read it because it is part of the school curriculum and isn't that messed up. And Chevengur actually sounded interesting. Didn't pan out that way for me, not at all. I didn't enjoy the process of reading any of Platonov's stories. I ended up reading 3. I read Chevengur, I read The Foundation Pit, and a short story called River Patuden. And that's mostly because I've almost given up on Chevengur like 10 times over the course of reading that story, so in order not to let it all go to waste, I needed backups. I will use The Foundation Pit as the framework for this video, and I will bring up points from Chevengur if they are phonetically relevant. Let's start by recapping the plot for The Foundation Pit. 30-year-old worker Vashov gets fired from his job at a small factory for his supposed penchant for thinking during work hours. Vashov is indeed very much interested in understanding the meaning behind things, the plan of life, but he doesn't find it in himself, so he goes out looking for other people who might have an answer. That's how he stumbles upon a group of workers who are digging the foundation pit for the future house of the proletariat, where all of the good Soviet people will eventually live. He starts working with them, and that's how we're introduced to a number of characters, like, for example, Engineer Prushevsky, who doesn't see a future for himself, so he's planning on ending it all, or foreman Chiklin. Chiklin and Prushevsky discover a commonality between them. As it turns out, in their youth they love the same woman, and Chiklin goes out to look for her. That's how he finds a little girl called Nastya, who is the daughter of that woman, and Chiklin witnesses the moment of the woman's death from starvation. The workers take Nastya in a very weird riff on the daughter of the regiment. They all take care of her. At one point they bring her, steal for her 2 caskets, one to sleep in and the other to keep her toys in. Eventually the caskets need to be returned, however, since 2 of their comrades were killed in the village where they were sent off to assist in the collectivization efforts. Chiklin and Vashov follow the caskets to the village, bury their comrades, and then assist in the collectivization/decolonization efforts under the guidance of the local activist. The search for the class enemies is assisted by a pet bear, who is also a blacksmith, who sniffs out these anti-Soviet elements. All the found kulaks, the wealthy peasants, are put on a raft and sent off down the river. Engineer Prushevsky, who arrives in the village with Nastya, finds himself a good woman and seemingly abandons the ideas of ending it all. Around the same time, a letter arrives for the activist accusing him of excesses, as per an article by Joseph Stalin, and so the activist becomes disillusioned and quite offended at all of them, and shows unconcern for Nastya's illness, and for that is killed by Chiklin. They return to the pit, Nastya's health deteriorates, and she dies soon after. Chiklin buries her deep in the foundation pit, burying the hopes for the better future along with her. And I would say that no recap truly captures the atmosphere of this book, so let's talk in depth. And as I said, I didn't particularly enjoy Platonov's writing, and I'm fine with that. He's simply not my author. There are some reasons as to why that is, some more rational than others. One of the main struggles for any reader, myself included, is Platonov's language. It is very peculiar, over the top in a very purposeful way. He never does what you would expect from him. Some of the more prominent features are like these incorrect structures, like thinking into one's head or closing eyes with skin. Also a lot of redundancy, like opening the door into space, or he was eating the body of the chicken. Also a lot of dependent clauses that are not always logically motivated, like for example, Nastya stood by the man because she wanted to. There are some also strict lexicological peculiarities that likely didn't make it through in translation, so I won't bother. There is an entire lecture and an actual doctoral work that can be done about the way that Platonov's language works. He is innovative and fashion-forward while also using language to support his themes. Like in the foundation bit, it is filled with these strict bureaucratic sentence structures that were used in the early propaganda slogans and general like office memos types of communication within the Communist Party, so that works. And it also helps with the suffocating nature of the novel, since bureaucraties is rather dry and restrictive. So that's all very cool, but the unfortunate side effect of Platonov overcomplicating his prose is that it is very difficult to read. After a while, my brain was simply checking out because, well, our brains are lazy and they rely on familiar patterns, and Platonov breaks all of them. The metaphor that one of the researchers used is like, it feels like you're stumbling on air. Like when you go down a flight of stairs and you're already at the bottom, but you expect another step to be there, but it's not there. So you kind of just crash into the floor a little bit harder than you expected to. So a stumble, not a dangerous one, but an unexpected one. And about 100% of Platonov's prose is like that. Your brain stumbles over every other phrase. And it shouldn't be a negative thing straight away. We should be using our brains and not rely on familiar patterns, but it wears you down. I remember I was a quarter of the way into Chevengur and nothing happened plot-wise, but I was exhausted, as if I've just read the entire terms and conditions clause from a service provider. And again, it's not a bad thing in a vacuum. In an academic setting, I can totally see researchers fawning over it, but for a casual reader, it becomes an obstacle on a long and winding road to finding meaning. And that search for meaning is one of the central themes of these books, and yet somehow I'm still not even close to finding it. Platonov's prose also kind of defies definition. Most call it modernist, that's probably true. The closest approximation that I can glean, it's like reading Kafka. There is purpose, there is meaning, but the events happening in the book don't actually lead us anywhere, and they almost seem like they're meant to confuse us. Chevengur feels like a fever dream where events, locations, people, they kind of blend together, and orienting yourself becomes extremely problematic. A similar problem in the foundation pit. The narrative is slightly disjointed, characters appear out of thin air and almost nobody has any backstory. Imagine a stage and characters are simply walking onto it, deliver a few lines to each other and then walk off, and then suddenly 10 scenes later they drop from the ceiling again. And because it is a shorter novel, closer to like novella length, actions happen almost instantly. I got distracted for like 2 seconds and boom, 2 characters are killed off in a completely different location. Paying close attention to what's happening helps somewhat, but there are some events that still defy logic and understanding. And that's why it's somewhat difficult to talk about this book. It took me a very long time to draft this script, and even as I'm recording it now, I'm not 100% certain that I actually managed to convey what I needed to convey, but let's give it a go. One thing that should provide some clues to understanding these books is Platonov's own backstory and his hiccups. Like why there are so many dead children in these stories. Well, that's Platonov working through the death of his siblings. Not just that, but partially. Or why Chevengur has a huge section about them fighting nature and doing like aeration projects. Well, cue Platonov digging like 600 ponds. Or why Chevengur starts with a huge section on the train. Well, Platonov didn't work with them for nothing, did he? Or for example, we know that Platonov at one point was obsessed with the ideas of this guy called Fyodorov, who wrote this philosophical doctrine called Humankind Common Task, which is the basis of the Russian cosmism, which is meant to regulate the forces of nature to defeat death and bring ancestors back to life so they too would participate in the general resurrection. And it doesn't even matter how bonkers these ideas are. We see mentions of it in the Foundation bit, where characters speculate that Lenin is lying in a mausoleum in his little glass display case, because eventually we should be able to resurrect him. Even more echoes are in Chevengur, where people try to live off of sunshine alone, and they do actually believe that immortality is possible, just like bringing back our fathers, but immortality only for those worthy of it, not for those anti-Soviet elements, those you can kill off without any issue. You're actually doing them a favor. They would never fit in the bright communist future, so you might as well send them off to their creator as soon as possible. It is also necessary to understand the historical context. These stories are so deeply rooted in the history of the early Soviet Union that you won't get far without it. Russian Civil War, collectivization, decolonization, new economic policy, and 5 years plan, and all that. And while all of these ideas are mentioned and brought up all the time, they are not the way that you would expect them to be, especially coming from a communist writer. Chevengur is even further removed from reality. Platonov is very liberal with time and space in that story. While the Civil War and collectivization are mentioned, it is rather difficult to pinpoint what's going on when. But even here in the Foundation bit, the two main events are collectivization to decolonization and the new economic policy in the first 5 years plan. But Platonov's world is intentionally almost like grotesque, phantasmagorical, without it being satirical. Like, for example, what happens in the village, how the wealthier peasants are snuffed out, how they attempt to eat all the cattle so not to give it up to the kolkhoz, and how they are banished from the village. That's exactly what happened in real life. Except nobody used a pet bear to find them, and they didn't send them off on the rafts down the river in some bastardized version of a Viking funeral. They killed them off instead, by the way. Or sent them off to Siberia. I don't know which one is worse. Or during the digging of the Foundation pit, one of the higher-ups decides to increase the size of the pit not 4 times but 6 times. That's also very typical for the time period. The expectation was not only to work hard, but harder and harder. The plan needed to be executed ahead of schedule. The famous slogan from the time was 5 years plan in 4. Because working ahead of schedule was supposed to bring that ultimate form of communism a little bit closer and establish that utopia that much sooner. But again, they're digging that foundation pit deeper and deeper, but it's not actually getting them anywhere closer to that bright communist future. It's probably getting them further from it, if we're being honest with ourselves. Because while the book is set in a very specific time period and cannot be separated from it, the main theme in it, however, is this search for meaning in an absolute sense, or the loss of it, depending on how you want to look at it. That's how we enter the story. Vashov was fired for having ideas, and so he goes out looking for the meaning of life, the idea behind it all. And just like a children's fairy tale character, he goes from one location to the other, asking people if they know the answer. There are some alternative answers given, but mostly over the course of the story, Nastya becomes that meaning, not only for Vashov, but for all of the men around her. They are building the Soviet house for her. An apt metaphor, is it not? Nastya, this young child who is, conversely, the most ruthless of them all. Her mother, part of the bourgeoisie, taught Nastya to blend in, and she took it a little bit too far. She sends the workers off to the village with the cheery, "Get rid of all of those anti-Soviets." She doesn't care when people die. Yes, the girl answered. It means the bad people must all be killed, or else there aren't enough good ones. She is radical and rather rude and blasé as well. I didn't mention it in the recap. There is a moment in there when Nastya is already sick and she asks Chiklin to bring her mother's bones. And since they didn't bury the mother in a traditional way and just simply barricaded the door to the room in an abandoned factory where she died, Chiklin goes there, breaks apart her skeleton and brings the bones to Nastya, who gleefully plays with them. This is the future they are trying to protect. Not only built on the bones of the bourgeois, but also the one that is built on fear and on simply repeating the communist slogans without truly understanding them. Because Nastya repeats things without understanding them all the time. If she is the voice of the socialist communist future, it is bleak. And that's even before she dies. But having that meaning and purpose in her is important. The men work for her. Vashov quite literally cannot work without this meaning. Vashyov too became so enfeebled in body without ideology that he could not lift the axe and lay down in the snow. There was no truth in the world anyway, or perhaps it had existed at some point. Some heroic creature by a wayside beggar passed by and ate that plant or trampled the low-bending creature, then died himself in an autumn ravine, and the wind blew his body to nothing. This is the mood of the story, by the way, if you're curious. The communist-friendly reading of the book is that Platonov was criticizing exactly that, like, don't get yourself any ideas and just get to work. I don't necessarily think that's the case. A fairly popular reading is that Platonov has seen the horrors of collectivization and decolonization and asks himself, what was that all for? Was it really worth it? But seemingly he doesn't find a good answer here. And that is what's so curious, if you will, that Platonov, a man fully behind the revolution, fully behind the ideas of communism, writes a book that is as anti-Soviet as they come. Yes, in a note found in one of his notebooks, he says that the loss of meaning that occurs with the death of Nastya is not a condemnation, but rather fear of losing that bright communist future. And yes, while he might have intended it that way, it sure as hell doesn't read like that. And especially now that we have the ultimate spoiler and the USSR is gone. So the book becomes this scathing critique of the Soviet Union and its policies, how it rounded up people to build this future but not giving them enough meaning behind it, only slogans, how inhumane collectivization is, and how it turns people into executioners and murderers, how it radicalizes children, and all of this seemingly for naught. How communism failed since it didn't actually give people what they needed. And what confuses me and the rest of the researchers is how Platonov couldn't have seen it in his own work. By all accounts, he was a smart man, so how could he have missed it? Researchers note that there is a stark difference between his fiction and non-fiction, as if his fiction is written by some alter ego that could see the failure of this Soviet experiment, while the partyman Platonov could not. Some even suggest some dissociative tendencies, mostly based on one recorded episode from Platonov's life when he woke up in bed and saw his double sitting at the desk writing something. It's taken it a little bit too far, in my opinion, but what else are we to do? That collectivization effort that Platonov went to, his nonfiction has not a lick of criticism in it, while the foundation bit, supposedly written around the same time, does. So where is this difference coming from? The best answer that we have is that he actually believed in the revolution and communism, but then he saw the ultimate flaws of the system as it turned out to be in reality. Okay, fine, but then I cannot understand the blindness to the fact that you couldn't write about it. And he did want to get it published. He wasn't writing it into the desk, as we say here. He wasn't like Bulgakov, who fully understood that the Master and Margarita would never get published during his lifetime, so he wrote it simply because he needed to write it, and maybe with some hopes of tides changing and eventually getting into print. No, Platonov fully intended to publish it during his lifetime. Simply, the censors wouldn't allow it. There was the party line, our way or highway. And Stalin's ways of dealing with people who dared to voice any concern were not gentle. So something is still not adding up. At the end of the day, the history puts everything in its rightful place, and while you still might stumble upon the foundation pit sitting on the shelf along with socialist realism books, it is very much criticism of it, and a very effective one at that, mostly because the foundation pit is an exceedingly gloomy work, and the reader closes the book in the most depressed state of mind. If at this moment direct transformation of psychic energy into physical energy were possible, the first thing one should do on closing the book would be to rescind the existing world order and declare a new age. The most important thing about the foundation pit is the emotion that it manages to translate to you. Reading this book is a deeply troubling, punishing experience. I felt like they were burying me in that pit. I felt like I was suffocating, like there was something pushing on my ribcage, not allowing me to take a breath and crushing my ribs. And it is a universal experience. I felt it, Brodsky felt it, other commenters felt it as well. It is a miserable experience. It sucks the life and hope out of you. Is it a good thing for your mental health? No, not at all. I full-on considered postponing this video until my mental health stabilizes a little bit and the anxiety levels go down. It's not been a fun couple of months. But then I thought that There is no mental state that I could be in for this to become bearable for me. One lecturer suggested that after having read this book 5 times, you start noticing the comedy in it, and we will just have to take his word for it, because I cannot imagine reading this book one more time, let alone 4. But in a strict academic sense, it is a powerful thing to be able to instigate this type of response and emotion in your readers through words alone, is it not? The unfortunate reality is that the emotional response is not a positive one. That's actually the same thing that bothered me about Dostoevsky. His shtick was also a lot of suffering sprinkled with animal suffering, but at least Dostoevsky believed in God, so there was some absolution to be found, at least after death. Platonov was an atheist. Interestingly enough, that Fedorov guy that I mentioned, his ideas about this immortality for all and bringing back ancestors, it is rather religious, or at least apocalyptic. That actually makes the Foundation pit even weirder, because there is no future in the pit. There is only today, and today sucks. Workers are sustained by this promise of the bright future, likely not for themselves, but for people like Nastya, but then that also gets crushed. They do find some purpose in the work itself, like it is the ultimate communist ideal, the man is meant to work, but it is a miserable life that they lead. The work is hard, the characters die left and right and become murderers left and right, no one is happy. Chevengur is also weird, by the way, because Chevengur is supposedly this utopia for the communism, where people try to live off of sunshine, there is no food, no possessions, no sex, no nothing, and they're simply waiting for communism to become apocalyptic, as I said. Ultimately, in my opinion, this is a book, or a number of books, that is very important for literature and for history of Russia as well, but is maybe not meant for a casual reading. And honestly, I'm perfectly fine if I'm not smart enough for some book. That's the reason why I still haven't read Ulysses, for example. I know that I'm not ready for it. And that's how I feel about Chevengur. Either I'm not smart enough, or not ready, or Platonov didn't give me enough clues to understand his novel. And honestly, I don't care. The Foundation pit is a little bit easier to read, the themes and tone are clearer, but it is much more emotionally taxing, so probably not the way to go either. If you like overcomplicated prose with somewhat scattered messaging, all the power to you. Or if you're interested in ideas of deconstructing communism, this is also for you, but otherwise, I'm perfectly fine with you skipping it.